Good morning, everyone, and welcome. By the way, I just checked the heat index. It is now 92 at 8:30 this morning, so this is technically the coolest part of the day. So when it hits 102 later in the day, we can look back fondly at this cool part of the day. Anyway, I am Bill Salmon, Senior Vice President of Editorial Content at The Hill. I'm so delighted that you're here. I want to thank everyone for joining us, whether you're online or whether you're in the room, for today's program, which is titled Matters of Life and Breath, Championing COPD Care. I especially want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their generous support in making today's program possible. And the program, of course, is about COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It now affects 25 million people in the country. It is the 5th leading cause of death from disease, on track to become the 3rd leading cause in the next decade if nothing changes. And that's because we have problems surrounding COPD, whether it's gaps in treatment, whether it's access barriers, and whether it's just a sort of general policy inaction. All of these things lead to bad outcomes, whether those be elevated rates of emergency room visits, or hospital admissions, hospital readmissions, or worse. The bottom line is that with 150,000 deaths per year and direct medical costs now approaching, I think, $31 billion a year, COPD remains a very big healthcare crisis, albeit one that is under-prioritized. So what can we do about it? How do we tackle the problem? I think the first thing is we have to look at some of the basic questions surrounding COPD, and I wrote a few of them down, starting with this. Will the Trump administration breathe new life into COPD care? How should gaps in treatment be addressed? How can public-private partnerships improve patient outcomes? What does a comprehensive COPD policy framework even look like, and when can we expect it? And in the meantime, and perhaps most importantly, how can patients with COPD prioritize their own health care, especially on a day like today? Fortunately, we're going to get some answers to these and other questions from the incredible group of lawmakers, policy experts, COPD advocates that we've assembled for today's program. And we're going to have a great discussion about that. But before we get to that, before we unleash these people on you, a few housekeeping notes. One, if you're in the room, please keep your phones, if you would, on silent for the duration of the program. That said, please do join us in the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, at #TheHillEvents using hashtag #TheHillHealth. Let me repeat that. #TheHillEvents, hashtag #TheHillHealth. And by the way, can I just take a quick moment and acknowledge one of my journalistic icons? Mr. Ted Koppel is in the house, so it's such a pleasure to finally get a chance to meet Ted Koppel. So thank you for coming, Mr. Koppel. I'm geeking out. I got to meet Ted Koppel. This is great. My day is complete. But anyway, now without further ado, let's kick off today's program with our special sponsor segment from AstraZeneca. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathleen Koch. I'm a best-selling author and longtime Washington correspondent. And joining me today is Liz Bowden. Liz is Vice President, U.S. Respiratory and Immunology with AstraZeneca. So welcome, Liz.
I'm so thrilled to be here. It's great to see the turnout for this important discussion this morning, despite some rather warm weather here in D.C. So it's great.
Well, you know, those numbers that Bill shared with us, those were really sobering, right? And I'm curious how many in the room know someone with COPD or have some personal experience with it? Let's see. Wow, it's probably about half, yeah. Right? At least. So obviously you folks are very familiar with it, but many in the room may not be, as well as folks watching. So Liz, could you help us understand what exactly is COPD?
Yeah, so COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's a chronic progressive lung condition. And for most patients, that manifests as breathlessness, chronic cough, fitting, and fatigue. And so it's a disease like we just talked about that affects 25 million Americans. And I think really the reason we're all here together today is because despite the high prevalence of the disease, in many cases it remains underdiagnosed, or in some cases misdiagnosed, or diagnosed later in the disease progression. And so
Why is that?
well, you know, it's sometimes due to the nature of the disease and how it presents. But what ends up happening as a result of that, Kathleen, is we see, I mean, the statistics are kind of staggering. Almost 2,000 hospitalizations every day in the United States, almost 4,000 or more emergency room visits, and 380 Americans die every day from COPD. So it's really a challenging and complex disease to manage. But I really think that when we come together, like we are in sessions like this, we can think about the best ways to tackle and improve the management of the condition.
So I know that it is like so many respiratory conditions generally caused by smoking, but smoking is not the only cause.
Yeah.
So help us understand that. I think, what is it, 27% of those suffering with COPD never smoked?
Yeah, and
cigarettes, I should say.
And smoking is a contributing factor, but you're absolutely right. There are other contributing factors to this disease. And I think the smoking part of it adds to some of the complexity, because as we know, there's sometimes stigma associated with that maybe leads to some of the challenges of delays in treatment or lack of urgency to act. But for some patients, it can also be a byproduct of occupational hazard, environmental hazards, genetic components that all can contribute to COPD. I actually even think about, on a day like today, how environmental factors can also make it worse for patients. With high heat index, we often see low air quality. And when there's low air quality and pollution and challenges, often the very first people to suffer are people experiencing respiratory ailments. So, you know, as an organization, AstraZeneca, we're really just, you know, passionate about being in this space of advancing care for patients with COPD, and also making big commitments about what we can do around the sustainability front for the health of the planet, because it's, you know, it's really our passion for what we're trying to do on behalf of patients and the physicians and healthcare providers who help advance care and get the right treatment patients need.
Well, there's so many connections, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you think about when we have these days when it's bad to go outside, right, because of smoke. You know, smoke from wildfires in Canada, whatever. And so that's got to make it terrible for people with COPD, but also more likely that more people will develop it.
Yeah, it's really more like an exacerbating factor for the disease. So, like, I mean, well, you asked about the question about COPD. I'm sure many patients, also people in the room here, either know or experience asthma. What variety of lung conditions just can be made worse by air quality challenges.
Why is it so deadly?
So, you know, so we talked about it's the 5th leading cause of death in the U.S. And it's, I think part of the challenge that we see here is while there's this 25 million Americans, about half of those patients remain undiagnosed. And so it's a bit of the nature, Kathleen, of the disease when patients are struggling to breathe. It's interesting because when patients are struggling to breathe, what you'll often hear is they start to you know, compensate a little bit. If I'm not breathing as well, maybe I just start to do a little bit less and I start to manage my life a little bit differently.
So they don't automatically think, oh, I should call my doctor and see what's wrong.
Right. And so as a result, you know, the disease can progress and perhaps remain undiagnosed, like we were discussing. And that can delay it, you know, delay treatment. And what happens is when patients aren't you know, managing the disease effectively, it can lead to more flare-ups or COPD exacerbations. And that's what results in the visits to the emergency room, the hospitalizations. And the challenging part with this chronic progressive lung disease is that with each exacerbation or flare-up a patient experiences, there's a loss of lung function that cannot be regained. So this is one of the reasons that we're so passionate about getting patients on the right treatments at the right stage in the disease so that they can avoid those, you know, honestly quite frightening exacerbations that lead to these visits. and just the day-to-day impact this disease has when you're struggling to breathe. So that's, I think, a couple of the factors that contribute.
So, quick question. I know we hadn't planned on this, but I understand it impacts women more than men. Why is that?
I think that, we probably can speak to the medical community who's here today, and they can share a little bit about the science behind that. But I think there is a perception that it's more men than women. And I think, again, awareness and education is a big part of why we're here together today and the work that we're doing, because we need patients recognizing, women and men, that this is something that they should be mindful of and that we should be treating aggressively and early.
So I know that public-private partnerships are often so critical, in advancing public health issues. Is that something that would be helpful with COPD?
I mean, absolutely. When it comes to any chronic and complex illness, I don't think that one organization alone can solve the problem. And so I think that's exactly the case here when it comes to COPD. The statistics on the impact on patients is staggering, but also the economic impact. You quoted the numbers at the beginning, but the projections are within 4 years, COPD costs are going to exceed $60 billion. And that's just COPD, not to mention that with a condition like this, the surrounding impact on comorbid conditions. So I think that coming together across private and public sectors, together with advocacy groups, I think that's when we can put the best minds together and determine what can really be done to break down some of the challenges that are standing in the way of patients getting the treatment that they need, some of the barriers that we've just discussed, not to mention some of the health disparities that impact us in this space too, whether that's socioeconomic factors, access to care, racial disparities. I really think it's the only way we're going to make impact in this space is through the continued work and partnerships.
It sounds like such, a disease that, as you mentioned, how severe it could be as we look into the future. But I thought fewer people were smoking today than ever before. So it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, and I think that it again goes back to education. I think a ton of education has been done about the importance of smoking cessation, the adverse effect of smoking on your airways and your lungs. But to one point is that there are other contributing factors to the disease. But I think that it's through continued work and education that we need to do on all these fronts that we can make an impact.
Why are you pushing so hard now? Why is it important that, I know we're going to have a representative of Congress here to chime in, but the policymakers, like the one we'll hear from today, and that the public sector join the private sector in this fight?
Yeah, I think that it was back in 2017 that the National Institutes of Health did the update to the National COPD Action Planning. And I think it's timely now with HHS's focus on chronic diseases that we need to make sure COPD is at one of those top priorities when we think about chronic diseases. You saw the hand raised in this room, the number of people that we know, that we love and care about are impacted by this disease. And so I think it's timely with this focus on chronic diseases to make sure that COPD is prioritized.
And so what can those in the room and those watching do to raise awareness? Because it really struck me when you said that when you have these events, you never get that lung function back. So early diagnosis is just critical.
It really is critical. And so I keep coming back to education, right? Education, timely medical interventions for patients to get the guideline-directed medical therapy that they need, and for the entire surrounding healthcare ecosystem to help support those needs through patient education, through the resilience we need in our healthcare systems to be able to manage chronic diseases like this and follow patients over time. These are challenges we face with a lot of chronic diseases, but it's certainly something we see and is amplified in the COPD space.
Liz, thank you so much for helping us better understand this serious disease that's taking such a toll on so many Americans. So join me in thanking Liz Bowden, Vice President, U.S. Respiratory and Immunology with AstraZeneca.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now please welcome to the stage our moderator for today, Julia Manchester, national political reporter at The Hill. She is joined by Congresswoman Maxine Dexter, a Democrat from Oregon, a pulmonologist, and member of the Doctors Caucus.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Let's dive right into it. I mean, I know that in the past you've talked quite a bit about treating patients as a doctor, as a pulmonologist. What's it like to treat those patients, and how have you been able to, I guess, apply that real-life experience to your job as a lawmaker?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and for being here and discussing this incredibly important topic. I guess it's hard for me to separate. I still am a doctor. I finished my last shift at the end of December, so this is not like a bygone era. It feels very recent. And taking care of people is the thing that I always wanted to do, and it is a privilege to be in a place when people are at their most vulnerable to help take care of them. The reality was that what I could do in the office wasn't what people needed anymore, whether it was access to healthcare or the ability to pay the co-pays. If I prescribe something and they can't afford to get it, I'm really not helping. So that was what compelled me to run for Congress, quite frankly, is that people weren't able to be helped by the things that I really could offer. We need to have policy changes in this society, so it's a great privilege to take that experience and bring it here. We obviously don't have enough people who have been taking care of people across the spectrum in Congress. I think one thing a lot of people don't realize is you take care of everybody, the houseless to the most wealthy, the most privileged to the least, the most marginalized. That's a cross-section of society that most politicians don't have ready access to, and especially those really personal things about them that lead to their illness.
Right. And I want to zero in on that a little bit and talk about sort of the barriers to care, the gaps in treatment that patients face. What do those look like from your perspective?
I mean, it can be anything from the fact that it takes 6 weeks or 6 months sometimes to get in to see somebody. If you are having, exacerbation of COPD and you have no access to the medications because you haven't been able to purchase them or you ran out and there's no one to prescribe them for you, you end up in the hospital because you didn't have access to the care you needed. So it could be just lack of access. It can absolutely be lack of appropriate level of care. If you're seeing somebody who doesn't recognize that your shortness of breath could be something other than just you're getting old or gaining weight, which are two of the very common things people are told, or they're anxious. Especially if you're a woman, no offense to anyone, but the reality is that it can also be that you're chronically exposed to particulate matter and smoke, and it doesn't matter what we do in the medical system, that you're going to continue to exacerbate things. So there's any number of challenges, but the reality is that we do not create a healthy society that supports people to be able to be self-reliant in their care. We don't give people the tools they need to be able to manage their disease optimally.
So I'm going to throw a pretty broad question out there. What's, I guess, the remedy to that? How, as a lawmaker, how as advocates in this room, how can people close that gap and sort of remedy those barriers that patients are facing?
Yeah. I mean, we have to acknowledge that this system was built by people who don't receive care or don't put themselves in the care receiver role when they are building policy, or the people that deliver that care. The system has never made sense, quite frankly. It needs to focus on keeping people healthy. We need to incentivize the outcomes that we want. And as Americans, we know that we have one of the worst outcomes we have the worst outcomes in the world for the amount of money we spend per capita. We need to rethink that. So that is a huge reason why I ran for office, is that you need to center patients and the care system that they're in to actually get the right outcome. So incentivizing keeping people out of the hospital, incentivizing patient-directed care. The COPD action plan from 2017 really elevated some of the things that people have agency to do: walking, rehab, having access to escalating therapy. We don't put those in the hands of people because, frankly, it is better for the system if they show up and need extra visits or if they end up in the hospital. We need to incentivize the outcomes that we really want to see.
Right. Just on the street, we know that the Senate is taking up President Trump's legislative agenda. There are, a number of potential cuts to Medicaid in that agenda. We'll see, what the final product looks like. But I wanted to get from your perspective as a lawmaker how, those potential cuts could impact treatment for diseases like COPD.
Make no mistake, this is a tragic failure in policymaking. To take away healthcare access for 16 million Americans, probably more because we're underestimating some of the dual covered individuals, I believe. We are setting ourselves up for a disaster. We're going to have rural hospitals. Oregon has many rural care centers. Our FQHCs that depend on Medicaid are often in our rural, underserved areas. We are not going to be able to sustain those care facilities. People are already driving too far. They already don't have access. Like, we will see the closure. We will see people lose access to care, so they'll show up in emergency rooms that are already overwhelmed. Like, this is a master plan in how to break a system.
Right, right. And, you know, we talked about the federal system, obviously, but we understand that no new state-level COPD action plans have been implemented since the 2017 NIH action plan. What do you think a new COPD action plan should look like?
I think it should be really focused around the patient and the access that they have. So I worked in the Kaiser Permanente system. We have a different model that I shouldn't say we, I don't work there anymore. But I think what we did is really put tools in patients' hands more than I think some of the outside groups would. So my patients had prednisone on hand, and they knew if their cough was increasing, they were producing more mucus and they were more short of breath, they should start taking it. Call our nurse, who they could meet with virtually, let us know, and we would check on them 24 hours later to make sure they're getting better. They knew what to do with their inhalers when they were having increased symptoms. It was actually putting an action plan in the hands of the people who needed it. And then they also knew when they needed to show up in the emergency room, and we had a system that could get them into the right care plan for an exacerbation quickly, getting on antibiotics, making sure that they're getting what they need. So we have to put patients at the center. If you tell them what they need to do, they are extremely good at managing. Yes. They don't want to go to the doctor. They don't want to end up in the hospital. So if you actually empower them with the things that they need to take care of themselves, it turns out they will. But we don't spend the time. We don't have the respiratory therapists on the care team who help counsel them and teach them how to use their inhalers optimally, to make sure that they're using their spacers, to make sure that they understand when their sats are dropping what they need to do. We don't encourage activity. We have great data showing the longer you can walk, the longer you'll live, regardless of your lung function. It's really important that people understand that, but we don't spend time counseling them because we don't have a system that actually supports that.
Right, right. And you obviously, like we said, have a lot of experience as a doctor, as a pulmonologist. I wanted to pick your brain to see if you had any real life, stories, anecdotes from working with patients with COPD. I think it's a disease that, obviously an event like this is spreading awareness about, but a lot of people don't know what COPD is. They just hear the acronym.
Yeah, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, I know a lot of people in this room understand that, but the reality is that the chronic obstruction is the issue that you're trying to manage. The reason for it is very diverse, whether it's alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency that somebody, inherited and has no ability to control, whether it's particulate matter from being, a miner or whatever, particulate matter you're chronically exposed to, silica if you're doing construction work, whether it's that you were a premature infant and you have it's not exactly COPD, but it behaves in much the same way, or that you were a smoker or exposed to a lot of secondhand smoke. There's a lot of different reasons. Pollution is a growing issue, like particulate matter in our communities is absolutely leading to this. And, we were trained, I'm not that old. I graduated from medical school, in 2001. We were taught that asthma didn't develop in adults. That's not true. It's happening now because people are being exposed. They're getting reactive airways because of the exposure in the environment. That's also leading to COPD with the irreversible components. And it's really interesting. I think it's an area that we need more research in, is why do some people get reversible airways dysfunction and some people get irreversible airways dysfunction with particulate matter exposure? We know that genetics has some component of that. Women manifest their exposures differently than women in a lot of ways. We know there's pink puffers and blue bloaters, and anyway, there's all kinds of different reasons that phenotypically people get different manifestations, and we're not doing enough research because, frankly, people don't have a lot of sympathy for the fact that they assume that people smoked and they deserve to get what they got.
Well, and zeroing in on that issue of air pollution, I know that you've talked about that quite a bit, in the Capitol and addressing the root cause of that. How, as lawmakers, can you address the root cause of that and sort of draw that link between air pollution and COPD?
Yeah, I think that it really is powerful to bring people forward. My patients who never smoked, who live along the I-5 corridor in Portland, who show up with COPD, you can't just say, well, I don't know why. You have a reason before you if you do a social history. And so looking at what environments people are developing illness, this is very basic public health research that can be done, and making decisions to change the HVAC systems or not put low-income housing along highway corridors where they don't have access to protection for themselves. We make policy decisions that lead to these adverse outcomes, and it's impacting our children. They're getting asthma at very young ages, and patients who have ever smoked are getting worse COPD over time because of ongoing exposure, not to mention the smoke and heat domes and all the things that really impact people's breathing. There are some COPD patients that'll move to Phoenix, Arizona because they do better when it's hot, and there's some that'll move to Alaska because they do better when it's cold. And you can't necessarily understand why, but it is very true that weather impacts people's breathing and how they function in the world. So controlling the environment in Oregon is not something that we've done very well. Only about 30% of households have air conditioning. I lost several patients in a heat dome event because they had no access to air conditioning. Wow. And they couldn't walk because of their COPD to get out to a cooling center. So I had 2 patients die in our heat dome of 2020 as a result of just not being able to get out of their homes.
How receptive have other lawmakers been, be it at the federal level or the state level or the local level, to ideas like maybe, where houses are built, for example, those environmental factors? Is that something that people have been receptive to and understanding of?
I don't think there's a lack of understanding. People know that we should have tree cover and that we should have, open spaces and a lack of exposure to particulate matter. We know this. It's expensive to make different decisions. It's hard to make different decisions. We've put low-income housing along areas, whether in Portland it's near the train depot, stations at the port, or it's next to the I-5 corridor. That's where affordable housing has been developed over time. So we could change that, but we already are having an enormous trouble just building housing. How are you going to move all of that? So it's a challenge that we need to make intentional decisions to do differently, and it's not going to be an easy fix. In the meantime, we mitigate it by making sure people have HVAC systems, that they have access to counseling and the impacts of chronic disease. We all know, it impacts how you feel and how you engage in the world. And so mental health for COPD patients is an extremely important problem. And do they have access to oxygen for people who are really severe? There's a lot of challenges. Apria is not well known for its extraordinary service, so we need to figure out how to make sure people get what they need. And I'm not trying to throw Apria under the bus.
No worries, and I know we have a few minutes left, but I think we're trying to end on a hopeful note with a lot of these discussions, because I know that there has been a lot of groundbreaking research and developments that have been made. What's something hopeful in this field that what are you hopeful about in this field going forward when addressing COPD?
We know we can do this. I had an alpha-1 antitrypsin patient literally my whole career. I took care of him for 17 years, who was on ongoing replacement therapy. We thought he was going to need a lung transplant for 15 years, and he just kept trucking because he had the ability to control his own symptoms. We can manage this disease. More importantly, we need to prevent it. So making sure that people understand, when air quality is bad and particulate matter is high, you should be wearing a mask outside. There are all kinds of political reasons people don't want to do that right now. So trying to, get away from that, making sure that people understand that smoking really is bad for you. We have an increasing risk of smoking in our children because of vaping and a lot of other things that then transition them into chronic tobacco use. So we have a lot of challenges that we can mitigate right away, and then the longer term ones are going to take some time. But the medicines are out there. We're continuing research and development in that area. There will be new genetic interventions that we absolutely, I'm sure, on the could be realized if we invested in COPD research. Right now, NIH funds are not coming readily. We have a lot of work to do there as a policymaker. There is absolutely reason for hope. There is no reason that something that has such enormous impact on our community that we can't do something about this. We have chosen not to be effective, and we need to choose differently.
Congresswoman Maxine Dexter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Gustavo Matute-Bello, Acting Director of the Division of Lung Diseases at the NIH National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute.
Good morning, doctor. Thank you so much for
Hello.
joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today.
Yes, and coming out in the heat. I know, as many of our speakers have said, it's quite a hot day in Washington. Let's jump right into it. What's the NIH's current strategy plan for combating COPD?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. And before I go into it, I want to mention that this is both professionally and personally important for me. I come here after more than 25 years as a practicing pulmonologist at a VA. So there's more than a patient who had COPD, as you can imagine. I had very dear relatives also with COPD. Two of my dearest relatives died of COPD, so both personally and professionally. This is actually a matter that's dear to me. And one of the reasons I came to NIH, I started this job in October, was because of the opportunity after, this life as a professional and in research to try to help something, for COPD. So there's a commitment, personal commitment that I have to this disease. And when it comes to the strategy, what I'm seeing is that, picking up on some of the topics, that there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be generated. We've talked about, for example, how we don't really know why some people get COPD and others don't. We've heard that some people who smoke get COPD, but others who smoke don't. Some people who don't smoke do get COPD. So who gets COPD? How does that pathway begins? Can we identify somebody and say, hey, you're fine now, but you started the track to COPD. We need to do something. So one of the things that I like is there are large cohorts in place, that start from people who are healthy, like the 4,000 patient, lung health cohort, all the way to when people start smoking, early disease, smokers and non-smoker, thousands of patients, and the goal is to actually effectively answer those questions. We need to identify treatments that are personalized. We can do it right now. The treatment for Peter may not be the same for Jane, even though those have a criteria for COPD. So we need to actually do that. And finally, very important, what happens to those patients who have disease, who need, in addition to pharmacologic treatment, support? We have something like rehabilitation. But rehabilitation requires that you go to a gym, or a rehab facility regularly. What if you're in a rural place? Can we leverage virtual approaches? We have programs, like tele-COPD trying to do that. So this important approach can reach everybody. How about nutritional support? Because people are using all their energy to breathe, and they get so that actually also important. And finally, it's been mentioned twice, the National COPD Action Plan. That's a call to everybody. NIH, we cannot do this alone, and the COPD National Action Plan is a call to everybody to join, patients, advocates, industry. It's only by getting together and analyzing the program from these different perspectives that we can really actually because the ultimate goal is that people who are suffering today will feel better, and people who are fine today will not suffer in the future. I think that's how I see it.
Right, and you mentioned, and the Congresswoman also mentioned this, there's so much we don't know about COPD. I mean, why some people, for example, move to warmer climates, or some people move to colder climates to help them deal with that. What are the obstacles right now to COPD research and learning more about the disease?
Yeah, so I can say, we have an ongoing program called COPD Gene, for example, 10,000 patients that are looking very deeply into the genome, the phenotype, the exposures, what called the exposome, aim at leveraging also new technologies like machine learning, AI, to learn exactly why does that happen. Those are ongoing studies. We're starting to learn from those studies. And from, the long health cohort, which are people who are recruited at 25 years old. These are millennials. We're starting to see, for example, that some of them at this early ages have started to have some findings on CT scan that are not normal. And we have to start seeing what does that mean. So if you have those findings combined with your individual exposures that you might have or your genes, would that actually be able not just to tell somebody why, but that somebody you will, beware, you need, there's these behaviors you may need to change. There's this maybe interventions we need to do so you never actually develop the disease, and for those who have it, how to prevent it from getting worse, how to prevent exacerbations. So I think a big bulk of our major cohorts at this point are aimed at answering those questions. And again, but we need everybody, which is why I call on everybody through things like the COPD National Action Plan as well.
Absolutely, and I asked the Congresswoman about this. We didn't get too much into the NIH portion of it, but there's been cuts to the NIH. There's been cuts to a number of medical programs under the Trump administration right now. How is that, or this year, how is that impacting research and from your perspective?
Well, we actually are obviously essentially bureaucrats, so Congress gives us funds, the administration gives us priorities, we enact those priorities, we inform politicians, and we are devoted to utilize our knowledge and resources to do everything we can to answer all these questions, and we're doing it, and we'll continue to do it. I'm committed to this disease.
Right. One thing that I think everyone in this room, I think a lot of people in general are very interested in is artificial intelligence or AI and how it's impacting, I guess, a number of fields. But, in preparing for this event, I was kind of struck to see that there's been, some work done in terms of how AI is shaping pulmonary research and treatment. Well, what have you learned about that?
Yes, well, one thing that it does, and it has to be done carefully, is that it's a tool that may allow us for the first time to do something we have never truly been able to do, which is to put together all this massive amounts of data, the genes of thousands of people, the exposures of thousands of people, the circumstances of thousands of people, and in a way that no single human could predict, start to generate, put that together. The AI can look at that together and start to tell us, there's this thing that you had never thought of that may be something to look at. So we have, for example, a program called Lung Map, which is the mapping of the healthy and normal lung from gestation to later ages in normal lungs and now in diseased lungs. All that information, all the structures, cells, communications, molecules is going into is now being put into some AI resources with the idea that you could actually ask, if I modify this gene in the setting of smoking, what will happen? And that's just a fraction of that. So I think we're going to see a revolution that I do hope will help, will really help us, achieve that goal that I mentioned. The people are suffering, and we have to stop that and prevent it.
Like I said, we're here on a very warm day in D.C. It's not even the hottest it's going to get today. We're not even in the thick of it yet. But I wanted to get your perspective on how environmental issues like air quality, climate change can affect people living with COPD.
Yes, well, it definitely can. And that's actually at a local level, one of the things where we can empower patients. We haven't talked about empowering patients, an important thing of COPD, that patients have the access to learning resources and also to devices and tools that let them control their disease. For example, there's some under our small business program, there are some programs right now at devices that will help you also identify, for example, different levels of exposures in your home, so you can see how that's linked to exposures and take actions to modify that. If you're a smoker, a former smoker, for example, would levels of particulate matter in the air in a given moment versus another put you in track to an exacerbation? Can you know about that so you can actually prevent it and do something about that, empower yourself so that you're not just saying, well, it's hot here and there may be pollution, but I actually need to do something right now because this increases my risks of getting an exacerbation. That's very much something that both, that is important, that matters even at the local level. If you have smoke, again, as I said, even particulate matter may actually make you worse, if you're a former smoker with COPD.
Right.
And we're looking into ways to tell that to the patient with advice that lets them take control of the situation.
You brought up some examples of empowering patients. I'm curious as to how people in this room, how the advocacy community researchers, how can they help empower patients with COPD?
Yes, well, it's something that we all have to do. It's not an individual. It's something that we all have to do. And one of the things that you can do is inform us. I fear that if I am no longer seeing patients, I may get a bit disconnected with that reality. So we need the continuous flow of information and feedback from patients, from advocates. There's a COPD National Action Plan. There's other venues, and also I think that organizations play a fundamental role in helping translate this knowledge and resources to the individual patient, how they're going to know that there's, for example, a set of resources that can help them. It's very difficult to access reliable information, especially these days, and I think organizations and advocate groups have a role that nobody else can play because patients trust them. So they can steer the patients towards what's relevant and effective for them. And if we're all partnered together, it can be very powerful, I believe.
I said this earlier to the Congresswoman. I think we want to end as much as we can on hopeful notes. So I wanted to, see what you're hopeful about in COPD research and COPD treatment.
I think that because of the new technologies that we have and the new understanding that we need to target this disease from well before the patient even feels sick throughout that chance and with not just drugs, but also supportive and non-pharmacologic treatment. And the new tools like AI, we really are at a position where we can produce knowledge that will change people's lives and make it better. That goal that I keep referring to, I think it's a possible goal, certainly with my lifetime, and I hope the lifetime of, those who are very sick today.
Right. And finally, what's one piece of advice you would offer to a patient, someone living with COPD?
I would say learn about your disease as much as you can so that you can actually take control of it. Your disease is yours. It's individual. Each person is an individual. You have individual features. So learn about yourself and your disease so that you can have the highest quality of life possible with a disease that is essentially living asphyxiated. So you can have the best quality of life possible, and we are willing to help you at least with our educational resources, give a little part for that, and here's where we all have to come in, advocates, patient groups, to provide that patient with the information they need to do that.
Dr. Matute-Bello, thank you so much. It was great
Thank you.
Chat with you.
We wanted to hear what states are doing to treat COPD. Julia sat down with Dr. David Mannino, Chief Medical Officer and co-founder of the COPD Foundation based in Kentucky. Take a listen.
So Dr. Mannino, I thought it was interesting looking at states with, some of the highest rates of COPD. And I saw Kentucky has one of the highest rates of the disease in the country. Why Kentucky? What is causing it there?
Well, there are a number of factors, and COPD is related both to, for example, history of risk factors, and Kentucky has several of them, including it has a historically high prevalence of cigarette smoking, but also people working in dusty industries such as coal mines. But COPD is also related to poverty. And Kentucky is in fact one of the poorer states. I think you combine those factors and you end up with a high prevalence of COPD, which Kentucky has had.
I'm curious to see, the state actions that have been taken, the federal level actions that have been taken. I mean, what has been done so far to improve life for people living with COPD in states like Kentucky, or possible preventative measures?
Well, yeah, and I've been chief medical officer of the COPD Foundation for several years, in addition to being a professor of medicine at the University of Kentucky. So yeah, and there are several different potential avenues to take. Uh, a large proportion, some estimate up to half people who have evidence of COPD have never been diagnosed with it. So one of the strategies is to find those missing people before they present with end-stage lung disease, because the thought is that the earlier you find these people and intervene, the better they can do. But also it's important to, once people have been identified as having COPD, that they be put on appropriate therapies and other appropriate interventions. For example, we always say that the key interventions in COPD is to decrease exposure, such as cigarette smoking or vaping or occupational dusty exposures, to maintain an adequate diet of lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, avoiding fatty foods and processed foods, getting an appropriate amount of exercise, and of course, and getting appropriate vaccinations. And these are all things that people with COPD can do to both improve the quality of life. We say add years to their life, but also add life to their years.
I want to go back to Kentucky. I understand that the state created the Kentucky COPD Advisory Board in 2016 to address COPD related issues on a statewide basis. I want to get your sense as to what progress has been made in the nearly 10 years since that plan was launched.
Well, yes, and I've been part of that task force since day one, and it's yeah, and we when we brought together people from a number of different parts, both of the state health department, for example, the tobacco program, the chronic disease program, the asthma program, but then also interested other groups from around the state, such as hospitals, pharmacy groups, uh, and we all meet quarterly to talk about what's happening with COPD in the state. But it's one of the challenges is that there's really not a large amount of funding either coming from the federal or the state government to support this work. So, but yeah, and the progress that we've made is that we uh, have been able to look at where the data on various metrics of COPD in the state currently are. Uh, we have a state action plan that is currently being revised right now to help come up with a path forward. But some of the challenges, as I mentioned, is that some of the major programs that have funded chronic disease research are currently on hold because of what's happening at the federal level. So we're working within those constraints.
And you mentioned a state action plan in Kentucky. Wanted to get your take on what more is needed from legislative as well as regulatory entities to advance the implementation of that plan, using Kentucky as the example.
Okay. Yes, well, it would be wonderful to have a steady stream of funding and dedicated, people that we could enact. I would love to see, uh, anybody with a diagnosis of COPD to ensure that they have access to lung function testing. I would love to see anybody hospitalized with COPD have access to a pulmonary rehabilitation program. Unfortunately, the number of pulmonary rehabilitation programs nationally has dropped fairly dramatically over the past several years since COVID, and that's also true in the state. I have for example, a patient in Berea who I've encouraged to go to a pulmonary rehab program. But unfortunately, the program that was in place in Richmond has shut down. So she has to drive up to Lexington for that program. She's willing to do that, but many patients are not. Um, and I think it's important to try to make things as accessible as possible for our patients, because particularly if in her case, she at least has an access and can drive herself. But there are many patients who may not have that degree of access or may have to depend on others. And the harder you make it to access resources such as pulmonary rehabilitation, the less likely it is to actually be done.
What could other states learn from the Kentucky model?
Well, I think it takes a village to make things happen, and and we still have a long ways to go here in Kentucky. Um, but for example, I know the COPD Foundation has been working with other groups to increase awareness of COPD through through a billboard campaign. Um, and there are other states um, have like more mature respiratory disease programs. Many states have had, I think we probably have perhaps 20 states that have had well-funded asthma programs, and that then also then provides, because it's that same infrastructure, that it allows one to also look at COPD as a public health issue.
So we talked about the Kentucky model and that state's plan, but I wanted to get your sense finally on the role states play versus the federal government. I understand there's a bit of a gap in terms of how they respond to the disease, put out preventative measures. Talk more about that.
Sure. That and the way the health systems work in the U.S., pretty much everything happens at the state level, or below. So if you look at things such as Medicaid expansion, that happens on a state-by-state basis. And Kentucky, in fact, is one of the states where Medicaid was expanded. So that's good for our COPD patients, because and there was just a paper published earlier this year that I was involved with, that looked at the relative proportion of patients with COPD in each state who have access to health care through Medicaid. And in Kentucky, that's it's a better proportion, than it is in some states that have not expanded Medicaid. And that's something, again, that happens on a state-by-state basis.
And finally, doctor, what are you most hopeful for when it comes to COPD research and advocacy going forward?
I'm hopeful that we have actually new therapies that have been approved in COPD, and there have been 3 different therapies approved within the past year now, and I think and these are providing new opportunities for patients, because we still have unmet needs in our patient population, people that continue to have what we call COPD exacerbations or flares, or we have people that continue to be very symptomatic, and we have people that despite many attempts still have not been able to stop smoking, for example. But what I'm excited about is that we now have several different therapies, both approved, and we have some additional ones that are in the pipeline that we expect to see approved within the next 2 to 3 years. And I am actually very hopeful that some of these will actually be able to make a difference in our COPD population. And for example, at the COPD Foundation, we're also interested in looking at people with earlier stages of COPD. And now we have several different therapies that we are looking at to see if there's potential to use these for people earlier in the disease course. So I'm hopeful for that. And I think that the next couple of years, I think we'll see dramatic changes in our COPD population, both in terms of interventions and how we can improve the lives of our patients.
Well, I know it's a very serious topic, but it's great to end on a hopeful note there. Dr. Mannino, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we move on to our panel discussion, the Hill invited Republican lawmakers to participate in today's conversation, but due to scheduling conflicts, we couldn't get a hold of them. So I would love for you to direct your attention to the screen for some recent highlights from Republicans working on COPD and other chronic health conditions. Thank you.
COPD is a respiratory disease that is the 6th leading cause of the death in the United States and affects 1 in 8 Americans over the age of 45. An estimated 30 million Americans are affected by COPD, but only 17 million Americans are diagnosed. We unfortunately see COPD impact neighbors in Southern California, with more than half of Californians who suffer from COPD living in our area. Today, on COPD Awareness Day, and throughout this month, we recommit to raising awareness and finding ways to mitigate the impacts of this disease. I'll do my part.
Chronic diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's cases are skyrocketing. We need to invest in technologies that will be able to catch these chronic diseases early and often.
Prioritizing disease prevention and addressing the factors that fuel conditions such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, Alzheimer's disease, COPD, and cancer will save lives, reduce costs, and build a healthier, stronger country. Private sector breakthroughs from groundbreaking cancer medications to curative gene therapies also offer hope. But misguided government initiatives and market volatility risk eroding American leadership in life-saving R&D.
It is now time for our panel, COPD Champions. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jean Wright, CEO of the COPD Foundation, Dr. John Studdard, a retired pulmonary and critical care physician and advocacy consultant for the American College of Chest Physicians, Josie Cooper, Executive Director of the Alliance for Patient Access, and Grace Ann Dorney-Koppel, President of the Dorney-Koppel Foundation and a COPD patient.
Thank you so much for all of you for joining me today for this very important discussion. It's great to see you all here on stage. Dr. Wright, I want to start with you. You've talked about COPD being one of the most under-recognized public health challenges. How has the condition been under-recognized in your view, and what attentions and resources to the condition are lacking right now?
Boy, that's a great starting point. We often refer to it as the invisible epidemic. So you wonder, how can something be of epidemic proportion and not be recognized? There's several different reasons. One, we don't have a routine metric for lung function that we do across our life. So if I ask people, what was your last blood pressure? What was your last heart rate? Even what was your last hemoglobin A1C, you would know it. But if I asked you, what's your lung function? You have no context for that. And without that context, it's hard to know that things are changing. Secondly, the symptoms come on subtly. And so what we might attribute to age, to menopause, to being out of shape, to heart failure, often become a confusing mask. And I think the pulmonologists on the stage already today and then later will talk about this even more. So a patient comes in and says, I feel fatigued, or I can't keep up with the grandkids at Disney World. That doesn't shout out COPD. And then thirdly, you know, it's one of the best kept secrets. I spend probably 95% of my time explaining it before I can even start advocating for it. So it's invisible, and yet to put scale on it, it would be the same as the population of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. If we had an epidemic that took over those three states, it would get attention. But because we don't recognize it, it's confusing. The people stay home. And one of our patients on the panel today has taught me so much about it, but one of her first phone calls to me was, Jean, I can't breathe, right? That should be so chilling to us to say, there are 30 million people that feel that every day. We need to make the invisible visible.
Well, Grace, I want to bring you into the conversation. You were diagnosed with COPD 24 years ago, and at the time, you were only given a few years to live. Tell us about your journey living with COPD.
Well, it would take us through all the heat of this day and tomorrow. So I thought, as Jean said, I was just slowing down. But no, I had 1/5 of the lung function that I should have had. No wonder I had difficulty moving and breathing. So my journey over 25 years, almost 25 years, has been one of acquiring knowledge and understanding that when you're short of breath, when you're coughing and you cannot catch your breath, when you are so filled with mucus that you can't breathe, you wonder if that next breath is coming. So you have one foot in this world and you have one foot in the unknown. And that happens daily to patients with COPD. And the signs are not recognized because they think it's middle age. And doctors, this is the thing you didn't mention, family doctors are not attuned to recognizing, A, women get this disease more. It's no longer an old man's disease. And it's not only a disease of smoking. It's a disease that's environmental. It's a disease that could be genetic. So what we've got to do is change this paradigm. We have to diagnose earlier. Family doctors have to be part of this. If they're not, we can't succeed. And we have to do more than empower patients and give them some knowledge. We have to give them better drugs. Dave Mannino was very quick to say we have 3 new drugs. What he didn't say is dupilumab, one of the new drugs, is for type 2 inflammation. If you don't have type 2 inflammation in COPD, that drug is not going to help you. The other new drug, ensifentrine, also called Ohtuvayre, is $3,000 a month. There are not many COPD patients who can afford it. And the third new drug, again, is a drug, a biologic that is borrowed again from asthma. So these are not drugs designed necessarily for COPD. They are drugs that fortuitously will help some patients with COPD. So my journey has been one of knowledge, of increasing frustration, because I think we are at a turning point. We've reduced severely, I mean, if this passes the Senate, we are trillions of dollars are leaving healthcare. Some of our best scientists and researchers are already gone from NIH. The NHLBI, the lung division, is being reorganized and I think incorporated with arthritis. And Medicaid, which keeps families below the poverty line, families who are desperate anyway, it will, for COPD patients in Kentucky and West Virginia and Mississippi, and it will be a death blow. So my journey is not only one of knowledge, my journey has brought me to a point where every one of you and everyone you know and every COPD patient and everyone who loves a COPD patient has to speak up, has to consolidate, has to gather together with those who share their views, has to support the Supplemental Oxygen Act, the Pulmonary Rehab Tele-Rehabilitation Act, because right now hospitals can't offer virtual pulmonary rehab. So those are 2 things you could do today when you walk out of here. And I ask you to do it because truly, life and breath is the subject, but it's really death of the soul and of the body.
Josie, I want to touch on something that Grace Ann brought up, and that's COPD being a women's health issue. I was wondering if you could just delve into that a bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think several of the speakers have already spoken on this, but we tend to see COPD as a men's issue, and that's just deeply narrow. It's untrue, it's unhelpful as you think about policy conversations. And so, one of the things that we're trying to do through the COPD Action Alliance, through our work, is to kind of expand the way we talk about the COPD community who's impacted, so that, there's greater awareness of COPD in women and COPD in veterans and COPD in firefighters, and so that we can broaden kind of the groups that are engaged in COPD work, and also encourage lawmakers who might have an interest in those particular issues to weigh in as well.
Right, and Dr. Studdard, I wanted to bring you in. I know that you've been studying this issue for 30 years or over 30 years. Where have you seen the most improvements when it comes to combating COPD and fighting the disease?
Wow, I think we're at an exciting time potentially in COPD. I did this for over 45 years, a long time in my hometown of Jackson, Mississippi. We're in the first half of that career. The tools that we had to work with therapeutically were quite limited, but with the advent of biologics in this space, that's the encouraging thing. There are a lot of potential available therapeutic agents that we've never had before. But the problem here is everybody's emphasized, is awareness, access to care, and affordability. And affordability and access are pretty closely linked. And in my Mississippi experience of taking care of patients, look, I don't usually disagree with Dr. Mannino, but I think we might be number one in COPD. We're either number one or 50 in almost every damn thing. Okay. So some are better ones than others, but this isn't a good one to be number one in. But we have a large population of rural poor patients in Mississippi, Black, white, Hispanic. And as important as these new therapeutics, or maybe more important, is the awareness of the disease, the awareness of our family practice, primary care physicians in these communities, knowing about these diseases and being sensitive to what fatigue or shortness of breath in men and certainly in women, as it's been well pointed out, in order to try to get these people to subspecialists. But access to subspecialty care in a state like Mississippi, you're not going to find many people like me in Louise, Mississippi, or Midnight, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. It just doesn't happen. And then you have the issue that you spoke with another speaker about social drivers or determinants of health become so important. Housing, health literacy, transportation, nutrition, all of these things that are maybe more important than therapeutics in the long run in a rural, poor state like Mississippi or Kentucky or West Virginia.
So, Dr. Wright, what kind of reforms are needed to enhance COPD care and patient access treatment? I mean, I think we've heard about what the issue is. We've heard about, the issue impacting rural communities, and I'm sure, other communities outside of the rural community are impacted. But what are the reforms that are needed?
We talked earlier about the COPD action plan. Great plan. What it lacked was action. It didn't get funded. It didn't get lit up. And so for about 8 years now, we've had a great guide and a great framework, but no funding and no accountability. So I think, first is go back to the book, right, and look at what we have. I think secondly, as John mentioned, we're concerned about rural America. I often say we like the concept of rural America. We just don't invest a lot in rural Americans. So COPD has twice the incidence in a rural zip code than it does in an urban zip code. So they're almost doubly disadvantaged because they've got a rural zip code. They're probably a farmer or likely self-employed or working in a factory or plant. So they're also getting environmental exposures. And then there's some distance from them in the care center, right? And then you've heard about the new medications. We're excited about it. But before those become affordable for them, it almost puts it out of reach. So we need reform that puts action in the action plan, that supports initiatives like the SOAR Act, the Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform. It's in the House and the Senate right now, so we need more legislators to sign on for that. Grace Ann mentioned the bill around virtual or in-person pulmonary rehab. You know, a lot of us, we're not very nimble in the world of Zoom and virtual, and we have crossed over that divide, and we can do all sorts of things that way. And so now we know if we can't provide brick and mortar pulmonary rehab, let's do it virtually. But our hands are tied by some of the legislation that's out there. So we've got actionable reforms just on the precipice and need to be voted through, need to be pushed through. And as several of the speakers have mentioned, we need NIH funding that's focused on COPD. How could we be third, fourth, fifth? We've heard a variety of numbers. Depends on, I like your analogy, it depends on whether it's high or low is a good thing, but we're too close to being at the top of the list in terms of chronic disease or mortality. Yet we've been 173rd in NIH funding. That's got to change. And I'm hopeful that the new emphasis on chronic disease will help raise that priority.
I'll open this up to the entire panel. We've heard so much, like you said, Dr. Wright, about the action plan, and I know you mentioned a lack of funding, but why has it, why haven't we seen the action plan, pardon the pun, but like go into action? Why has Grace Ann?
Well, I was there at the press conference when it was announced, and we were all so hopeful. At that time, we knew it was a document, it was a piece of paper, and unless it was put into practice, it would just die on the shelf. Well, for every other action plan, including the asthma action plan, money was allocated so that it could get started. That was not the case for the COPD National Action Plan. Also, I want to mention that the focus on rural is what Ted and I, with the Dorney-Koppel Foundation, have devoted since 2007. We've devoted our lives to it. We have Grace Ann Dorney pulmonary rehab clinics in West Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Louisiana, Maryland, and the newest one is in Georgetown Hospital in Washington, D.C. So pulmonary rehab is a treatment that has not been mentioned but should be. We've had this treatment, but it was not available. We have a program now that I'm very hopeful about in West Virginia. All of our clinics there are 8 or 9. Patients are reimbursed for their travel. Their co-pays are paid, and people without insurance can access the program and use it. Now, that's an in-person program. But I am hopeful, since there are many PR clinics in West Virginia, that we will be able to include all of them in this. And that's the public-private aspect of coordination that was talked about. So we have engaged other foundations who support us in doing this work. And in this interim, while we're without funding, I do think that's one of the avenues that is the most hopeful for us. But it really requires some kind of action. People have to support this. You have to contact your Congress people, and you have to get others. You have to activate them, which is what the COPD Foundation is doing. And I know, John, you've devoted your life to this as well. And you're new, but you're devoting yours as well. So it really will take all of us to make this happen. And this disease, Jean is quite right. This disease has always been disproportionately funded and researched relative to the number of people who have it and who are dying. 160,000 deaths a year in the United States. Hundreds of millions of people have it in the world. And somehow, what is COPD? It's a killer. And what we have to do now is what Mother Jones did. What we have to do is mourn the dead, but fight like hell for the living. And if we don't do that, many, many patients are not going to be served or diagnosed or treated.
Right. Josie, you co-authored or authored a study, this year that found that utilization management can fuel physical burnout. How can this, coupled with post-pandemic physician shortages, affect both physicians and patient care for COPD?
Sure. So it's a great question, and a lot of folks have already talked about the time it takes for a patient to get to a healthcare provider and the impact that has on a COPD patient. So our organization, the Alliance for Patient Access, did a survey of about 500 physicians to really understand what's the impact of utilization management tools, so these insurance barriers that doctors are fighting every single day. What's the impact of those on physician burnout? What does that do to their willingness to stay in practice, to tell their med students to stay in school? And what we found was, the impact significant. More than half of physicians say they're spending more than 6 hours a week doing paperwork. They say, about half are currently burned out, which I find terrifying. We heard folks saying, I tell med students not to continue. I'm considering leaving the practice. So you think about the impact that has on, the availability of clinicians. We don't have enough clinicians. We talk about it all the time. And if we don't reform some of these tools that are making their lives harder, we might end up with fewer, not more. So if our goal is to increase physician availability, to shorten the length of time to a diagnosis, to get people treated faster, we need to encourage policies that support clinicians rather than, make their lives more difficult. I say all that because, in addition to the SOAR Act, in addition to the Pulmonary Rehab Bill, there are bills in Congress right now that would reform those practices. There's the Senior Timely Access to Care, which would reform prior authorization. There is a copay accumulator reform bill, Help Copays Act. We're pushing for Safe Step to be reintroduced. Those are all bills that would take action to make it easier for a patient to get care and for a physician to prescribe care. And so when you think of, increasing access in rural America, those are actionable steps we can be taking.
Dr. Studdard, several studies have revealed that 1 in 4 patients with COPD suffer from symptoms of depression. Earlier, Congresswoman Dexter talked about how COPD is in many ways a mental health issue as well as a physical issue. Can you speak to that correlation from those studies?
Without question. I mean, that makes perfect sense that a patient with chronic disease that people don't understand very well, that has poor recognition across, at least it certainly does in the United States and certainly worldwide, I'm sure. There's a stigma attached. Patients don't want to appear short of breath. Patients want to be able to do what their coworkers or friends do. Look, I think all chronic diseases lend themselves to depression, and certainly COPD is one of those. But what gets me concerned and depressed to a degree is all these issues that we talked about, where it's been going on for a while as far as adequate funding and awareness. But we find ourselves now, as hard as we're working on that, if we were in a favorable environment in the city of D.C., we're not in a favorable environment right now. I think it's an unusual time in my career as a physician, and that there's an attack on evidence-based care and public health in our country. And it has a direct impact on the disease of COPD. Vaccine skepticism. Vaccines are critically important to our patients with chronic disease like COPD. Cuts in Medicaid and potentially the Affordable Care Act marketplace, where over 10 million people who now have a bare minimum of insurance are going to lose insurance and lose access to care. NIH funding, I've heard the previous speaker, but the facts are the facts. The NIH funding if it hadn't been for research being funded, the biologics for 10 years from now, those scientists no longer have funding to do basic research. And equitable access to care, which certainly the climate for that right now at a federal level is not a good climate. And I think all the problems we had going even a couple of years ago, we're having to park those a bit to answer all these acute problems of this week in this city.
Right.
And it's a real concern to me as a person who's done this for a long damn time. So.
Right, right. I want to stick with the mental health issue
Yep.
because I think in general, within COPD, outside of COPD, mental health is still stigmatized in this country. I mean, and I'll open this up to the panel. I mean, do you think, do doctors understand in terms of patient advocacy how much of a mental health issue COPD is? Is there that understanding, or does there need to be more education on that
I can
front?
speak to a physician's perspective. I was in private practice, not in academic medicine, and not in a lab. Every day of my career, I was seeing patients. And I would think all subspecialists in pulmonary see that firsthand. They have to appreciate or understand that. So no, I think there's an awareness of it. Is there a sensitivity and an awareness to those primary care docs and other providers that are so overwhelmed already? Do they have time to consider that? And with the paperwork burden Josie referenced earlier, you can only do as much as you can do. And so I'm not being critical of a lack of awareness of those other physicians. But I think pulmonologists certainly are aware, and certainly in our practice, we were sensitive to that. I mean, we became good friends with our patients. We saw them all the time. So.
Right, absolutely. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to get a sense, and Grace Ann, we can start with you and go down the panel. What solutions are needed moving forward, or are you looking forward to seeing to COPD moving forward?
Well, I am looking forward to many things, but I don't know if they're going to actually occur. I'm looking forward to more medications in the pipeline. I'm looking forward to care for people in rural and distressed urban areas as well as people in urban areas themselves. I'm looking forward to people understanding that this disease is a major killer and a major disabler. I'm looking forward to getting back on track with research into this area where I feel that we have lost so many good people, colleagues that I've worked with for years at NHLBI and CDC. By the way, there is no more a chronic disease program at the CDC. That has been totally eliminated. I am looking forward to a change in attitude where Americans will say, enough, we care about our health. We care about health care. We care about other people's health care. That's what I'm looking forward to. Now, whether that's coming to fruition or not, I would not know, but I hope that we can make a difference in making that happen.
Josie?
Absolutely agree. And, one of the things that it's just a really challenging policy time, right? And so, Gracie Ann mentioned we're kind of the new kids on the block. So the reason I'm up here is because AFPA launched about 6-8 months ago the COPD Action Alliance, which is a coalition of now about 25 member organizations, some folks in the room included, who are advocating together for better policy at a federal and state level. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do is identify new champions, because we need more folks. If we're ever going to make any of this happen, we need more folks who care about COPD. We need to, you said this once, Jean, we need to make ourselves so big they can't go around us on these policy issues. And we do that through partnerships. And so, what are we tackling? We're trying to raise visibility up on Capitol Hill, for one, as well as support state lawmakers in implementing, things like the Kentucky plan. We're grateful that that's out there. We want more states, doing something similar. But I will say what makes me hopeful is that, we have a huge number of partners in this work, folks in respiratory, folks in women's health, in rural health, all who are coming together who are passionate, and I find that very helpful.
Dr. Studdard?
Wow, hopeful. Hopeful because of new therapeutics in COPD. Concerned that we've gotten off track, like I referenced earlier. Another tobacco, which isn't the only cause of COPD, but probably still the leading cause of COPD that we're aware of. The Center for Tobacco Products at FDA just lost funding. The Office of Smoking and Health at CDC lost funding, all in the same day. Yes. Our two biggest partners in this space of tobacco control in this country. It was the biggest blow to tobacco control in the last 30 or 40 years. We just need public to have the sensitivity and awareness of the crisis situation I think we find ourselves in. Because, and again, that takes up so much energy that we should be spending on all these other things. And I'll emphasize what Josie pointed out. I think the potential of partnerships, and something I stress all the time, in relationships in these spaces are critical. Because me knowing this wild woman on my left here who's with the COPD Foundation, and these great patient advocates in this space, you know, these kinds of relationships are where we potentially can bring the public awareness and sensitivity, not only to where we find ourselves in public health, but in COPD.
And Dr. Wright?
Wow, great act to follow there. I'm encouraged, I'm hopeful that we are changing the face of COPD. If I had asked you to close your eyes and picture a patient with COPD, depending on your generation, you might have thought of somebody after World War II, a man, a cigarette hanging out of their mouth, and you know, showing like they had lived kind of a rough life. That was a picture, but it's not the picture. As we've mentioned today, it's now shifted, right? And now women are 50%. And as Grace Ann said, we present it earlier in life with symptoms. We get a heavier burden of symptoms, right? It's probably our height difference, it's probably our genetics, it's probably our hormones, it's probably what was marketed to us, right? It's all of that. So now the face is changing from older men to middle-aged women. My personal plea is that OBGYNs will begin to recognize this because the symptoms come out around the time of menopause. And then I want people to recognize the face of COPD actually in children. It's almost impossible to get COPD without certain childhood events. Smoking in your environment, your parents smoking, your prematurity. I have a son that was premature. I talk to him all the time about COPD because that lung was impacted right there, you know, at birth. The neighborhood you live in. There's a certain zip code in LA that if you were raised there, the buses driving by had such fumes that you as a child were exposed and your rate of COPD is higher. COPD is a childhood disease. That's not on people's radar right now. And so my hope is that we will change the face to include all those faces and realize, yes, smoking is an accelerant of that, but 1 out of 8 of us will get it, and it won't be from smoking.
And that's something we haven't touched on, the childhood aspect, and I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we have to wrap it there. Thank you so much to you all for such a great conversation. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. We appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.
Yeah, she does do a good job.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks to all our wonderful speakers this morning. On behalf of The Hill and our sponsor AstraZeneca, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us here in person and those of you who tuned in online. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, the full event video is available on thehill.com. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.